Today's guest is Scott Horton. He's the director of the Libertarian Institute, the editorial director at antiwar.com, which is a great resource. I've been going to that website for, it seems like, probably well over a decade. Also the author of a new book called Provoked. And let me get the other part of the title because I don't remember that by heart. How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Let me start with this here real quick. We're going to cue up the A1. This is what America politics was like a year ago. Go ahead and play this video. This was on the U.S. House floor after they sent your money to Ukraine.
On this vote, the ayes are 311 and the nays are 112. The bill is passed. Oh, one voting present. I missed it, but thank you.
And there you see the Democrats on the left side of the House floor waving a foreign flag. By the way, they've had Zelenskyy speak in front of the U.S. Congress. Go ahead and cut it there, Dustin. Speaking in front of the U.S. Congress many times, telling us why we need to send your hard-earned money. Actually, it's really not even your hard-earned money. They're going to print the money. They're basically going to issue government debt, and they're going to print that money to buy up that debt, which only makes your children more burdened by debt. Because Ukraine's so important. So then we fast forward to it's not yesterday, Friday in the Oval Office. And here's a clip from what went down with Donald Trump and Zelenskyy.
Trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's exactly what you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
Feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
And if you haven't seen the whole video, you guys can go check it out. It's also on my X account. That is the tone of the meeting in the last, I think it was 10 minutes. Before then, Trump, I thought, was very reserved. So, Scott, I want to bring you in. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm told by the mainstream media and the Washington establishment that you're either for Zelenskyy and the people of Ukraine, or you are pro-Putin. You're just a Russian propagandist. And, you know, the funny thing is, I don't think Putin is a great guy. I think he's a terrible guy. I think he's wrong for invading Ukraine. But I also think that Zelensky's corrupt and that it's a money laundering scam over in Ukraine. And we have no vital American interest in Ukraine, and we shouldn't be sending our blood and our treasure over there. Where do I go wrong with that viewpoint?
I agree with you 100%. The only thing is you left out how this is all America's fault in the first place. And so not that I'm saying that means that we owe them to continue to back them in this war, but this never would have happened if all of the previous governments going back to the end of the last Cold War had not insisted on this policy of maintaining American dominance, not only in Europe, but even in Eastern Europe, and expanding the NATO military alliance right up to Russia's borders, and consistently threatening since W. Bush to bring Ukraine in as well. And I think they saw their opportunity with, I think they were out of patience for the ongoing civil war in the East. That was the result of the Obama and Biden coup of 2014, or overthrow, I guess, of 2014. And then also the renewed promises to expand the NATO alliance to include them. And at the same time, even though they weren't moving that fast on that, they were expanding what was called the interoperability of Ukraine's military with ours. In other words, giving them as much as possible NATO standard ammunition and weapons and communication systems and command and control, hierarchies and all the rest of the things to integrate their military with the United States and with the NATO military alliance as much as possible without giving them the war guarantee that NATO membership includes. And so, as many scholars said at the time, this is really the worst of all worlds. It's America saying, you and him fight, and we'll give you some weapons and we'll help you some, but we know you're going to lose, but we hope you get some good licks in on the other guy because we hate him. Right. And what the hell kind of an irresponsible foreign policy is this for America to have? And then, of course, Joe Biden is just the quintessence of the American empire, this doddering, old, half insane, completely bankrupt and illiterate warmonger / idiot, right? Goofball. No idea what to do. Can't even speak in in real terms about what's happening has to continue changing the subject to Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler 80 years ago, because he can't even articulate what's actually happening in the situation that he's got us into. So the whole thing, and that's why I call it a catastrophe in Ukraine. It's not just a slaughter. This whole thing is, blowing up everybody's interests all the way around.
What was Biden's policy? I almost feel like they don't want to say this, but they kind of do say it, seem like, that it's literally to starve the beast, the biggest enemy. They were told that Vladimir Putin, Russia, is the biggest enemy to America, and their policy is just to starve the beast so that they're less powerful for an inevitable future war with America. I mean, is there another policy that they had other than that, even though they don't want to say that? But that seems to be what it is. And of course, that's going to result in millions dying in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, look, I think, okay, even if you go back to W. Bush and Barack Obama, remember when Obama and Hillary Clinton first came in 2009, they tried to do the so-called reset to try to get along with Russia, and they were the ones who blew it, as I demonstrate in the book. They had their chance. But if there is, deep strategy behind this, essentially what it is that the American foreign policy establishment in total considers China to be the looming threat for the rest of the century. And so the question is what to do then about Russia, just as it was in the days of the old Cold War, where Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon made an alliance with Mao's China, an informal one, but still with Mao's China, to split them away from the Soviet Union, to split the smaller partner away from the larger one. And in this case, they're essentially divided. Some of them have wanted to essentially cozy up to Russia and coax Russia into integrating more with the Western system. But see, the problem is they're the ones contradicting themselves. They'll never truly let Russia into the European Union or NATO. Those things are, at the end of the day, still at Russia's expense. So there's a hard break on how well they can ever integrate Russia into the West, but the point being to split them off from China. But then you have people like Joe Biden and his staff, or I don't know what Biden thought about anything, but his staff like Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken, they're thinking, as represented by another major faction of the foreign policy establishment, is, well, in order to weaken China, instead of cozying up to Russia and wooing them west, we'll just bog them down in a conflict in Eastern Europe and weaken them so that in any conflict with China, Russia won't be any use to China. So this is all stupid. And see, and I especially encourage your MAGA audience to listen very, very close to the very good things that Donald Trump says when he's not contradicting himself, because he does talk about things like we don't need to have a major power competition with Russia or China. We can get along just fine with all the major powers of the earth. We don't need this constant state of militarism. There's this great economist named David Stockman, who was Ronald Reagan's budget director. He's a really great capitalist and economist and historian and writer and pundit, and he's really great. And he calls the entire American military establishment post-World War II the Great Deformation. Now, you could argue whether it was necessary or not to stave off the Soviet Union, but those days are dead and gone. And that all came to an end on Christmas Day, 1991. And so what Stockman argues is the entire American empire should have come home from Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia then. And the truth is, if you take the globe, just like Bill Hicks said, also back 30 years ago, spin the globe. There are no enemies. There are no major powers of the earth. We're friends with everybody in Europe and could be with Russia. We're essentially at most economic competitors, but we're really friends with China. India has no major power. There is no major power in the Middle East or in Africa or in Latin America for us to deal with ever. We have no enemies in the world. And Donald Trump acknowledges this. So much of, speaking of the American foreign policy establishment, they say it's time to switch from terrorism to major power competition. But maybe it's time to switch from all of these things to peace and liberty and capitalism and prosperity.
And trade.
And security here in America.
And trade, right? We can
That's
trade
right.
with other
America
countries.
First. That's right. And look, Donald Trump is a bit protectionist, and I don't agree with his tariffs, although we'll see how all that shakes out. He's essentially I don't know what his long-term policy is. Right now, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. He's trying to cut some deals with some of those tariffs. But I'm for free trade, and I'm essentially a Ron Paul guy, and that means that, like Thomas Jefferson said, we want peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations of the earth, and entangling alliances with none. We want revolution in one country, ours. And we have our Declaration of Independence, and we have our Constitution. That's what we should be striving to protect. And you can see how tenuous liberty is. You can see how quickly it can be taken away.
Well, look at COVID, right? I mean, that should have been a wake-up call for everybody.
That's right. And look, why do we even have this behemoth in Washington that even thought that they could dictate to us? It's because of the world empire, right? Controlling the world means we have to have an internal empire also based in Washington in order to control us so thoroughly, more than any other thing, to make us pay for the cost of their world empire overseas. You know, they don't take much in tribute from the conquered vassals. Essentially, the American taxpayer, we're the ones who have to pay tribute to the empire as they conquer the rest of the world. And it's totally unfair, and any American could see it now. You were so right to begin this, just talking about the money. This is, you know, there was an old saying in Washington, a billion here, a billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. Yeah, well, you'd have to be a politician to talk about it like that. I mean, he was joking, of course, but from the point of view of the average American, $1 billion? Imagine what you could do for your county with $1 billion. Imagine where that billion came from in the first place. Your county. And they just pissed that away in 10 seconds time. Meanwhile, the people of North Carolina still don't have shelter. The people of Maui and the people of LA, who've all been burned out of their homes, are stuck with a check for $700 and a good luck.
Or the government doesn't take it in the first place and it stays with us, our family, which right now, by the way, life is becoming less affordable because of the inflationary policies of Washington, the Federal Reserve. We got a Rumble rant. It looks like a question for Scott. So let's go ahead and read
we got a $5 Rumble rant. G. Ballstad asks, what events do the left and State Department point to when claiming Russia invaded Ukraine, and why is that incorrect? Thanks. So, Scott, I guess the question is, what is the State Department and left? What are they arguing about the beginning of the war, and what is the truth of the matter?
Yeah. Okay, well, they certainly did invade in 2022. No question about that. If you want to go back to 2014, I mean, the truth is the war started then, and it was Obama and Biden, John Brennan, who started it, and they overthrew the government there, and they insisted, after the Russians took Crimea, they insisted that the new regime launch a war against the people of the East who were essentially refusing to accept the rule of the new junta. And so that makes what happened in February of 2022, at least, you know, somewhat fuzzy. It's, I'm not excusing it at all. I agree with the other host here who said that, you know, absolutely it was the wrong thing for him to do it. It was an invasion. He escalated, if you want, he escalated the war by 100,000%, where it had been this low-level slog from the time that Minsk II or Minsk I and Minsk II deals were signed in the fall of 2014 and in the early winter of 2015 there. And so, you know, I agree with them that it was wrong for Russia to do that. In my speeches and so forth, my best analogy essentially is that America put Putin's back to the wall. Joe Biden did. Put his back to the wall, and he decided not to let himself get boxed all the way in a corner. He decided to go ahead and fight now, which is the kind of thing a guy like him might like to do. But I would point out that, again, the whole foreign policy establishment knew better than to do this in the first place. Oh, sorry, not again. That was the last interview. The whole foreign policy knew better than to do this in the first place. And one of the wisest people who weren't against it back in 1997 was George Kennan, and he had actually helped to coin the containment policy against the Soviet Union back in the 40s. But in 97, he said, listen, by expanding NATO and making Russia still the object of it, even after the fall of the Soviet Union, the way that we are doing, we are making them an enemy, and we are guaranteeing a negative reaction from Russia. And he said, all of the NATO expanders now who say, don't worry, it'll be fine, the Russians won't mind, or whatever their excuse is, then they will say, see, that's just how Russia is, and that's why we need the NATO alliance. So, in other words, he's saying this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're making an enemy out of Russia, and then once they turn enemy, you're going to say, see, they're our enemy, and that's why we have to do the things that we're doing. But so everybody should just go back and remember who was at step one. The Soviet Union fell apart. The people who ruled Russia at that time were the people who had heroically overthrown the communists and should have been our friends. And we're essentially kicking dirt in their face and being a bad sport and guaranteeing a negative reaction.
Yeah, Scott, you and I have a similar background. I was a delegate for Ron Paul in 2012. Prior to that, I was an Army officer deployed to Kosovo during their unilateral independence, which America cited, and NATO cited. By the way, on our base in Camp Bondsteel was Ukrainian soldiers, just FYI, although they weren't part of NATO, but they were part of NATO, against the Russian-backed Serbia. And we allowed during 2000, was it beginning of 08, 07? I'm already forgetting. Allowed unilateral declaration of independence by Kosovo, which would have been southern Serbia at that time.
Oh, wait.
So, I mean, like, and by the way, this is what drove me to Ron Paul on top of the Fed and the problems with monetary policy was the fact that I lived it. And then Iraq after that, by the way, deployment. It's like, I lived it. I saw the stupidity of this policy. I still remember, because we had to respond to the backlash of the independence, a billboard in the northern part of Kosovo with Vladimir Putin on it, right? Because they were pro-Russian. It's like, we've been doing this for some time. So from my understanding of history is there was assurance that NATO would never expand east of Germany after the fall of the Soviet Union. Well, fast forward to 2007, and here we are in Kosovo with NATO forces. To me, that seems to be the biggest provocation of war. Not that I'm justifying what Vladimir Putin has done, right? It certainly wasn't the last straw, so he's wrong for doing that. But it's not like we're some innocent party that didn't provoke this. Where am I wrong on that?
No, you're not wrong. That's exactly the case that I make in my book. It's not called Justified and Good Job, Russia. It's called Provoked. Because what did they say? They said it was an unprovoked attack, an unprovoked attack, an unprovoked attack. Well, come on. Doesn't that sound like somebody's guilty conscience talking? Why do they name it that? You know what I mean? Like, you have to call it unprovoked. You're trying to... It's like it's baked into the thing. They might as well call it the "Don't ask us how we provoked this attack." It's so obvious right in the name of the thing that they're trying to hide their role in making this happen.
Well, clearly he's on the payroll of the Kremlin. I mean, Jesse, there's no way he's thinking freely on his own here. He's just, these are pro-Putin talking points. How dare you, Scott Horton?
Yeah, that's all they ever say. Here's actual reasonable argument, right?
I know, right? And you're an American and a Texan, right? Which really makes you an American, or makes you really a Texan, right?
That's true.
Okay, so one of the reasons I wanted to do this show, mostly because Minnesota politics got so absolutely boring here in the last couple of weeks. Although Tim Walz says he wants to run for president in 2028, or says he's open to it. So,
be kidding.
Yeah, well, I would say it was all a joke, but we lived.
Laugh this afternoon, buddy. I appreciate that.
Yes, I know. I said, do it. All right, so you know, I've chatted with my brother, who's generally on the same side of politics as me. He seems to see things in the eyes of a Ukrainian person, which I understand. I think there's a rational reason why you would look differently on Trump's performance on Friday if you're coming from that perspective. But I can't place myself in a Ukrainian's perspective in this case in politics, because it's our blood, it's our treasure. Luckily, it's not blood at this point, at least that we understand, but it's our treasure going over. So first of all, that I have a huge problem with, especially when we're $2 trillion added to the debt every year. But the second one is the blowback of this policy. I mean, I think we made so many mistakes in the Middle East in the last 20 years. We made big mistakes in Afghanistan, but that pales in comparison to a mistake against the largest nuclear power in the world. It's insane. Right. So make the argument to these people who I mean, obviously the left, I almost just got to ignore the people on the left, because they've lost their minds. I remember an anti-war left. You know, I've been in this politics for over 20 years. I remember that. But the people that maybe are sympathetic to Trump but don't see it eye to eye with us, make this argument to them why we have to look at this in America's interest.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, first of all, look at the Ukrainians' interest, right? Again, we got them into a fight that they can't win.
That's a good point.
They're losing more and more guys, more and more money, more and more territory every day. Their cities, as Donald Trump has correctly said, are being smashed to smithereens. I mean, there are entire cities in the east of Ukraine that are just going to have to be completely bulldozed and rebuilt if they're to be ever saved at all. I mean, it is absolutely just catastrophic. Just the intensity of the warfare over there. It's like World War I plus drones, right? Fighting in freezing mud, in trenches with tank and artillery rounds blowing up all around you, plus drones dropping grenades on your head or, hunting you down and getting you in the back. It's an absolute nightmare of a conflict over there. And the Ukrainians cannot win it. No matter how many weapons we give them or what weapon systems we give them these kinds of tanks, we give them these kinds of rocket systems and missiles, we give them all the intelligence, and we have special operations forces and CIA and contractors on the ground helping them use these weapons and picking targets for them, running tabletop exercises in Germany, trying to figure out what are all the best things that they can do in all the battles, helping them run the whole war, and they can't win it. And so what happens is they lose more and more guys and more territory all the time. And so the only solution
can I stop you there for a second?
Sure.
Dan Crenshaw tells me something different.
Well, yeah, but he's just wrong, right? Like,
right?
Okay,
right?
he didn't say this, but let me be charitable to him for a moment. He maybe just couldn't remember the name of the place or something, so he didn't bother to spit out that there are Ukrainians in Kursk, inside Russia itself, right now. But they're way out in the country, and they're mostly being ignored, and it was apparently an attempt to try to convince the Russians to pull some troops out of Ukraine and move them there. And they said, no, we'll just remove them slowly, whatever it takes, but we're going to stay on the offensive in the east. So it was a gamble by Ukraine to do that, but it doesn't change anything really in terms of the situation in the war or how much territory they've already lost or who has the momentum on the ground. There's just no question that time is on Russia's side here in this conflict. It always has been, and especially since even the fall of 2022 was the last time that the Ukrainians made any significant progress against this is just a few months into the war, right? In September of 22 was the last time that they made any significant progress against the Russians. It's been all downhill since then. And everybody understands that Britain and France and Germany ain't coming, and Poland, they're not all going to combine into a new land army and go in there and reverse this. And if they did, that would be risking nuclear war. Or we could also send in the 82nd Airborne and the 3rd Infantry Division, the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Navy and Air Force to go in there. They could reverse it, but that, again, would lead to a nuclear war. And so, as you said, we're spending all this money, but luckily no American blood yet. But it's absolute horror show on the ground for the Ukrainians, and the blood being risked by our government and the previous administration in getting us into this, and by the Europeans who are still pretending that they're talking tough here and want to intervene in the war somehow, is the destruction of our entire civilization, the death of every important American city, and a bunch of survivors who wish they died in the first place. We would lose 100 million or 200 million people on the first day. 60 million people, the number of people who died in the Second World War would be killed within the first 45 minutes or hour of a thermonuclear war with Russia. We would essentially lose all of northern civilization. America and Europe and Russia would all be completely wiped out.
Even if they didn't go to that measure, putting the 3rd Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne on the ground, that comes with massive costs to American troops. They're not going to go there unscathed, right? This isn't Gulf War I. And
That's
so that alone is a terrible policy. But this is where I'm going with this is I feel like the left, the media, the Washington establishment, I Patch McCain and all, are living this delusion, and some of them have to know this is a delusion, that there's some way Ukraine can win this war without us deploying the 82nd Airborne. Like,
right. I think
and that
they
doesn't
know
exist.
That's not true. They must know that that's not true, but they just don't want you talking that way. I had this debate with Wesley Clark. I mean, imagine little old me debating a 4-star general, the guy who ran the Kosovo War in 1999 for Bill Clinton. And I made him admit it, and he finally did admit it, that yes, it's true that Ukraine cannot win. Their situation is only getting worse all the time, the longer they stay in the war. But we shouldn't be talking like that, young man, because, that, sacrifices our great position when we try to negotiate. But, you know, and this was funny because this is J.D. Vance got into a Twitter argument with Richard Hanania last week about this. It was the exact same conversation that, you know what, I'm pretty sure the Russians know where their soldiers are and at what rate they're killing and dying. And they don't need to learn that from me. And it's ridiculous to say that we could, like, what, you're going to send Antony Blinken? Not that he would ever sit and negotiate with the Russians, but that would be the idea. You would send him or Rubio or someone else in there to sit down with Sergei Lavrov and lie to him and tell him, come on, Sergei, everybody knows you guys are losing and we're the ones in the position of strength, so you better do what we say. No, that's completely laughable and stupid. So what's their argument? They don't have one. You know, you see, and it's like a gift to me, I guess, that it's Bill Kristol and David Frum and all of these absolute idiots who've been wrong about everything, who all say the same thing. It's the big stab in the back with no explanation of how we're supposed to turn it around for the Ukrainians in any other context.
Yeah, and that's the extent of their brain power, the people that have been running foreign policy since, well, I'm sure we could go back to Clinton, but certainly George W. Bush when we became the country of endless wars. All right. First of all, I watched that debate with Wesley Clark. That was one of your better ones because it was just you two. I think you guys briefly interacted on a previous panel with Piers Morgan. I can't stand the fact that Piers Morgan puts you on a panel with a bunch of other people that quite frankly don't even belong there, and you get very little time to talk about it. So in that case, you were bouncing off each other, and it was a very good dialogue, in my opinion. I'm torn on this, Scott, because I love watching you on Piers Morgan, but at the same point, it's the wrong format for you, but do what you're going to do anyhow. They've
learned the lesson that, you know, they always make sure that I go last because I'm going to not stop talking.
Yeah, I know. And then it's really funny to watch how frustrated you get by these people, but some of the things that they're saying is so absurd. And of course, one of them is, well, two of the big ones is like, oh, you're pro-Putin because you actually can think for yourself as an American. And number two is the fact that there's any chance Ukraine can win this war, which is just so utterly stupid. Okay, so here's the question I have for you. And I agree with you, obviously, with your book. By the way, for people that don't know, what's so interesting about his book, and if you're like me, you're not going to go to the front first because, boy, you don't have that much time. He starts, I think it was with George H., right? Or was it Reagan?
Yeah.
It was
H.W. Bush, the end of the Reagan years, but yeah.
Yeah, so he's going by presidential terms to get to where we are in the modern day. What a great book. I thought it was relevant in December, and now it's really relevant. So I agree with you on this. I think Trump's made some errors in a lot of things. But I was just so excited to see what he did on Friday. You know, it's not – I was explaining this to my brother. We got into this stupid debate about what he was wearing at the Oval Office, okay? And I said to him, it's not so much that he wasn't wearing a suit. I just don't care. I don't dress up. I used to wear a suit when I was in finance. It is what it is. The problem that I have with the fatigues and the stuff that he wears is I see it as a show. It's a show. It's a big show that we need to be pro-Ukraine to the point where Congress is holding up little mini Ukrainian flags. And I am sick of the show. And on this show, you know, that's why I got Mega Jesse. He balances me out because I've been very critical of Donald Trump on this. I'm very libertarian. And I ended up voting for Trump because I made I guess I hoped that Trump would actually do something the second time. I hope his explanation was he wasn't a Washington guy. He had the wrong guys in front of him the first time. So I made that leap of faith. And so far, you know, I could pick little things here and there. I've been relatively surprised. And it really came to fruition on Friday when he basically said the things that I've been thinking and a lot of people have been thinking for some time now. Now, that was just one day, one little 10-minute spiel. Where does Trump go from now on? In your mind, the best thing he could do going forward in terms of Ukraine?
Well, look, I'm just for total non-interventionism. I ultimately think that it's not really the role of America to tell Ukraine what they have to do other than with the weapons we give them. But otherwise, I think, no, America should simply leave and leave it up to them to sign their own peace deal with Russia on their own terms. Donald Trump could just reverse all of Biden's sanctions and all the rest of that and just declare that he hereby normalizes relations with Russia. There's no reason. We don't even need to negotiate that. He could just do that himself. And, what happened in the Oval Office there was, it was ridiculous. It was amazing to sit and watch the guy try to talk over Trump.
Yeah.
To disrespect him like that and all of that stuff. But focus in, though, on what it was that when the argument broke out, I mean, they've been sitting there talking for 30 or 40 minutes before he really went after Vance. Well, what had happened was Vance was saying, we have to negotiate an end to this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he interrupts and essentially says, how do you negotiate with a guy who breaks deals? Putin is insatiable and he'll never stop until he's defeated. And once we defeat him with your help, then you can give us a war guarantee so he never comes back again. But essentially implying, but you're a damn fool if you think that you can get him to just make an agreement on paper and then stick to that. And so that was where Vance said to him, all due respect, I'm completely astonished that you would try to litigate this in front of the press here in public and contradict me or contradict the president sitting here in the Oval Office on camera rather than having this discussion. Now, they should have had all this hashed out behind the scenes first. Typically, that's how these things work is, we have a mineral deal here, we have a potential ceasefire deal here, and then we have the makings of whatever security guarantees they're going to discuss or whatever it is, hopefully none. But Trump and Vance made it clear. They want a ceasefire. They didn't make it clear, but they heavily implied they accept Russian gains on the ground as irreversible, and they don't want to fight about that. They just want an end to the war and a ceasefire and to normalize relations and move forward from there. And Zelenskyy, apparently, I don't think this was just him blowing his top, right? I think what happened was he made a strategic calculation here that America's throwing him overboard. If he's going to get any more money and weapons from us, it ain't going to be much. And that he doesn't want to quit the war now. I think he stupidly believes, I don't know what he thinks is going to happen in the future, but he seems to be betting on the Europeans coming with money and weapons and potentially even soldiers to try to help him in the war.
But if that's a result, then good for us in America, right? Even though I want the bloodshed to end, but far better.
Yeah, no, I mean, Britain, France, Germany, and Poland combined don't have a big enough army to actually field in Ukraine and fight Russia with.
Right,
now,
right.
They can stay home and they could keep Russia out of their own countries, no problem, in a conventional fight. But they don't have the manpower or the resources or the money or the logistics or anything like that to wage a war against Russia through Ukraine without America running it all for them, and they know it. And so they're not really in a position to give him what he wants. So I think, at best, he's a damn fool for not saying, at least in private to Trump that, look, whatever, get me the best deal that you can get me.
Right.
But that's in the position. He's lost the war.
Right.
I don't know if this really is part of his calculation or not, but I can report to you that Nazis have threatened to blow his head off or hang him from a tree numerous times in the past if he would dare make a deal with Russia. Mm-hmm. And that was back before the worst part of the war. That was when he was first elected in 2019 and shortly after that, where they said, listen, if he makes peace with Russia, then that is sacrificing all of the losses in the war so far. That's throwing them away on the sunk cost fallacy, the way they used to talk about Iraq. And we can't leave now because what about the guys we already got killed for nothing? They had to have been killed for something, and whatever it is, we'll find out at the end of the war, right? And so that's kind of what they're saying here, and that he would be dishonoring the sacrifice of the men who've already died. And so, and they've just made it clear they'll blow his head off.
So Ukrainian Nazis and Senate Democrats
tried to kill Trump, remember?
Right. Ukrainian Nazis and Senate Democrats are aligned that he should not take Trump's deal. Interesting stuff. Let's go to, we only have him for a couple more minutes. Let's go back to that Rumble rant.
Yeah, we got another Rumble rant asking who controls U.S. foreign policy on Palestine, whether that be Benjamin Netanyahu or Trump. And he also asks whether or not you think troops will be deployed to the Greater Israel Project.
Oh, taking us off mark here on Ukraine, but that's fair. You paid for the Rumble rant. Let's go ahead, because I know Scott Horton speaks truth on that issue too.
No, it's very important. I mean, to boil it down, Miriam Adelson calls the shots, but who's she? She's Netanyahu's guy. She's an Israeli American who married an American Jewish billionaire casino mogul from Macau, and who launders his billions into the Republican Party to keep him good and Zionist. And I think Trump, I read a thing one time that Trump always looked up to Adelson as a gambling casino business guy, that this is like the cream of the crop. And he always hoped to fit in with a guy like him kind of deal, you know, in status in terms of casino moguls. But Sheldon Adelson has said his only regret of life was that he joined the U.S. Army instead of the IDF, and had demanded that Barack Obama nuke Iran in order to set an example for them that they better not try to make a nuke, or that's what it's going to look like when we kill them all. And he had said over and over again that he has one and only political interest, and that is Israel. And so he gave $100 million to Donald Trump all 3 cycles. Well, he's dead now, so his wife, his widow, took care of it the last time around. All 3 cycles, they've written him a check for $100 million. And you might even remember that Donald Trump actually had, on Twitter and in public, had criticized Marco Rubio for taking Sheldon Adelson's money, and says Sheldon Adelson thinks he can just buy Marco Rubio and make him his perfect little puppet, which is true. Well, who's the Secretary of State now? Adelson's perfect little puppet. And Donald Trump took that money, and as we can see, and as we all know about Donald Trump, he's a transactional guy. They didn't just give him this money in the hope that he would think of them when Israel issues come up. They've got a deal, and I presume, I don't know this for certain, but I don't presume it. It's been widely reported in the Israeli press that the deal was for the West Bank. That I guess at some point in the next term that they will annex the West Bank and attempt to cleanse the Palestinians out of there, as they've been doing in Gaza. And you might remember that the last time he was president, and he stated this, I don't remember the exact words, but essentially he made it clear that it was for the money. It was a transactional thing. He got all this money from the Adelsons, and so this is what I do for you. And what it was he let them convince him. He even said, yeah, it took 5 minutes, which means 3. And they explained that Israel stole the Golan Heights in 1967, and they want to keep them. And he said, all right, fine, I hereby recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And then they said, as Clinton, Bush, and Obama had all promised to do, he went ahead and moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Now, that's important because the Israelis claim all of Jerusalem as the eternal, undivided capital of Israel. And so by America moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it's essentially recognizing that, even though half the city is still occupied or you know, not occupied, but lived in by the Palestinians. And in the peace deals, they were supposed to get East Jerusalem to be the capital of the Palestinian state on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which, of course, Likud policy is to deny them hell or high water. And so by doing this, they're essentially kicking them, even in the future tense, the possibility of them making East Jerusalem the capital of their state. They say now you'll have to settle for this little suburb called, I think it's called Abu Dif, which is this little suburb east of East Jerusalem, where they're supposed to make their new government someday, which will never come anyway, I guess. And then he did these Abraham Accords, where he bribed the Sunni kings with American tax dollars and weapons to recognize Israel, even without them making peace with the Palestinians, which they had always held out for. So they weren't really, the Abraham Accords weren't really peace deals, but they were normalization deals. And what they really meant was, as Netanyahu put it in his speech at the UN in 2022, I win, you lose. The Netanyahu doctrine is I get everything I want. I get all the Sunni kings to come to me, and nobody's coming for you. No citizenship, no independence. You'll just have to live in your open-air concentration camps and learn to like it or not. And then it was 3 weeks later that Hamas broke out of their pen and kicked off the latest round of violence with the October 7th attack there. So that was Netanyahu's policy before, and that's why it was Trump and Kushner's policy before. And now, so the second question was, and what about, do I expect for there to be American troops in Gaza? So here's my good news for you. I think that when whoever it was convinced Trump to announce that America's taking possession of the Gaza Strip, I think that the silver lining here is that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And when somebody explains to him the facts, or has already explained to him the facts, he's already willing to back down on this. And so the facts are the Palestinians aren't giving up. So what are you going to do with them? And Trump had talked like, well, I'm going to make a magic wish and they're going to vanish like on Bewitched, or I'm going to get a giant broom and I'm just going to shoo them out of there. But what happened was the Israelis just slaughtered them by the high tens of thousands for the last year and a quarter and year and 3 months there. And they didn't leave, and they don't have anywhere to go anyway. And even if some of the refugees had been allowed to flee into Egypt, the fighting age males are still going to stay and fight and hold on to that territory. And so for Trump to take that territory would mean war. It would mean sending in, again, like we're talking about with Ukraine, sending in the 82nd Airborne, the 3rd Infantry Division, the U.S. Marines to go through and fight in an urban combat disaster type scenario, just like at Samara 06 or Baghdad 07, and where our guys are getting shot and killed constantly and blown up to death constantly. And I know he doesn't want that. And he said, well, no, we're not going to put troops on the ground there. Yeah, well, then you're not going to get it because there ain't no such thing as magic. And so you're stuck with a situation where, just like the Israelis are stuck with the Palestinians, and who are the people of the Gaza Strip anyway? They are the refugees from what we now call Israel, which is the land that the European Jews came and stole from them. And these are the refugees, like 80-something% of the population of Gaza are the people and the sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters of the people who were ethnically cleansed off of their land in 1948. But they won't just give up and lay down and die. And the Israelis have already proven that they can't get rid of them. They lost, officially at least 400 guys trying to get rid of them this time, and they had to back out.
Scott,
and they had to back down, and now the Palestinians are back in the north, and they're essentially would have to start the war all over again. So,
Scott, I want to. I know you got a hard stop here at 45 after, so I want to.
No. Is it 45? Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't know I had to go that early.
Yeah.
Hang on. No, I still have a few minutes.
Oh, I'll take it. I was trying to be respectful of what Connor said. So yes, go ahead.
No, that's
Continue
okay.
on.
So yeah, on that thought, so now, okay, I had originally thought that my initial impression was just, I get what he's doing, right? Is he's trying to play hardball and get the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Qataris to take responsibility for it. And he's just saying, well, I'm going to take it over, so that they would say, no, you don't have to do that, so that he could say, well, then you do it then. But then I've seen him give a couple statements, including his interview with Bret Baier, where like, no, I don't think that this is some even two-dimensional plain old chess game. I think he really meant what he said about taking it over. But then it played out like that anyway. And they held this conference I think it was in Cairo, where the Saudis and the Qataris and the Egyptians all said, well, no, here's what we'll do. The Egyptians will take back over the Strip, and the Qataris and the Saudis will finance its rebuilding. They said that they would create a new civil administration that would be independent from Fatah and from Hamas. But they said that they would not require Hamas to disarm, although I guess they would ask them politely to stay the hell out of the way. And so that, to me, that's like the best case scenario, quite honestly, of what could happen there for the short term, for the people there to have something to eat and a safe place to live.
If I could finish on Ukraine here.
Yeah.
So just going back to that, thanks, Gunnar, for bringing us over to Israel, as if we could do that justice in 5 minutes.
Antiwar.com every morning, everybody.
Exactly, antiwar.com. Do you think Trump is being genuine, though, in his statements about he wants to see people stop dying? Because it seems to me, even if it was economic reasons, that would still be much better of a course than the current course that we're on. But do you think he's being genuine when he says that he wants to see an end to the bloodshed?
I'm not exactly sure what Donald Trump is ever really genuine about. He clearly has decided that that's his best argument against the war, is just a bunch of people getting killed essentially for nothing, for what's already a lost cause. And it's funny because maybe it's just that we never hear anyone in Washington talk that way.
Right.
None of them are at all.
I know
so
he's not in. This is a deviation from all his predecessors, right?
But he did say the same thing about the other wars too, and this is something that even going back to his debates with Jeb Bush, he goes, listen, this guy's brother ruined everything, and we have to hold that against him. There has to be accountability for that. And he talked about how, they completely destroyed Iraq. They helped create the basis for the rise of the Islamic State Caliphate in eastern Syria and western Iraq and all of this stuff. And he said, and all of the civilians, all of our soldiers, but also all the civilians over there who've been killed and for nothing. And like, quite honestly, I think it's a very normal sentiment for any regular human to have if they're not a government employee. And at that time, he was not, right? He's a lifelong business guy and show business guy and other things. But I think, like, anybody could tell you that. They're like, geez, imagine getting blown up to death. Part of your body blown up and the rest of you got to bleed out sitting there, like all of us have seen enough movies. If we haven't seen anybody, I guess I've seen a couple car wrecks, man. If you've ever seen someone die violently in real life, and then also, on the question you mentioned earlier, blowback, meaning the consequences from American foreign policy. I mean, think about how devastated you are when somebody you love dies of natural causes in their old age, how much that hurts. Now imagine someone you love dying way before their time because they got exploded to death by some politician from somewhere very far away. Like, that's the kind of vengeance that might not sleep. Like, this is the kind of problem that America, this is what Ron Paul said in 2008 in the big Giuliani moment. He says, using the government royal we, since he was a congressman at the time, but obviously he's the one who knows better, says if we think that we can just go around bombing people and intervening around the world like this and not cause resentment and consequences, then we do that at our own peril and the peril of our people that we're sworn to protect here. We're putting the American people in danger, creating enemies for them with all of this intervention. And so, he's probably the only other guy who really talked like that think about the poor civilians on the other side.
Right,
So,
and that's all I want is I want peace for my children, my grandchildren, and I think most Americans do. I want to plug 2 books. You mentioned David Stockman's Great Deformation, which actually is on my bookshelf. Great book. Also, your new book, Provoked. I'd highly recommend it. I think I probably bought it on Amazon, or people can go to antiwar.com, I'm assuming. Where else would they find your book?
Sure, yeah, scotthorton.org, and you can sign up for my podcast. I got 6,000 interviews and change going back to 2003 for you there as well.
Well, I'm humbled that you joined us. We come from some similar backgrounds in the Ron Paul community. And actually, MAGA Jesse, despite being a big Trump guy, also is very libertarian-minded, too. It's 5D chess all the time, right? I love it. Thank you, Scott, so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Take care.